Chapter 1. Introduction. Australia, a continent full of stories. Australia. This name immediately conjures up images. Endless deserts, bright red rocks, rainforests full of exotic animals, wide beaches with turquoise blue water, and vibrant cities like Sydney or Melbourne. But behind the geographical beauty lies a history that is as complex and fascinating as the continent itself. The history of Australia is not a linear narrative, but a multi-layered chronicle of cultures, encounters, conflicts, discoveries, and changes that spans tens of thousands of years. Long before Europeans even suspected the existence of these distant Südlandes, people lived here. The Aborigines, the indigenous people of Australia, settled the continent more than 60,000 years ago and developed one of the oldest continuous cultures in the world. They lived in harmony with their environment, created myths and spiritual stories, the so-called Dreamtime, and built up a deep knowledge of their country's plants, animals, and climate. Their story, passed down orally through generations, remains one of the most important foundations for understanding Australia today. But the world outside the continent remained distant for a long time. While empires rose and fell in Europe, Australia remained an unknown spot on the map for most people. Few seafarers from Asia touched its shores long before the great European voyages of discovery of the 16th and 17th centuries began. Only gradually, with the Portuguese, Dutch, and British expeditions, did Australia enter the consciousness of the Western world. When James Cook landed on the east coast in 1770 and claimed the land for Great Britain, a new chapter began that was marked by radical upheavals. In 1788, the first fleet arrived in Botany Bay, and with it European colonization began. Initially intended as a penal colony, the small settlement in Sydney quickly grew into a society that developed its own rules, conflicts, and possibilities. But this arrival also had a dark side. For the Aborigines, it meant displacement, disease, violence, and the loss of their ancestral habitats. In the 19th century, colonization expanded. Explorers penetrated inland, sheep pastures spread over endless expanses, and with the gold rush of the 1850s, people from all over the world flocked to Australia. The continent, once referred to as the empty expanse, was transformed into a land full of hopes, conflicts, and new identities. With the Federation of 1901, the scattered colonies became the Commonwealth of Australia. From then on, it was not only a matter of populating a country, but also of forming a nation. In the First World War, Australian soldiers fought in Gallipoli and on the Western Front, and these experiences became an important building block of national identity. In World War II, Australia faced the threat of Japan and found a new partner in the United States, which permanently integrated the country into the geopolitical orbit of the Western world. The post-war period brought change. Waves of immigration from Europe, and later also from Asia, made Australia a multicultural country. Economic developments, from agriculture to mining, created wealth, while social movements won more rights for Aboriginal people and liberalized society. Today, Australia is a modern country, characterized by diversity, prosperity, and a vibrant democracy, but also with unresolved questions about its identity, its environment, and its role in the world. Australia's history is thus the story of a continent that has been reinvented again and again. From the first humans who left their mark on the red sands thousands of years ago, to colonial expansion and the struggles for freedom and justice, to a modern nation that today moves between tradition, present, and future. Chapter 2. The First Humans, Aborigines, and the Dreamtime. Australia is one of the few places on Earth that was settled by humans so early and permanently. Archaeological evidence suggests that the first groups of Homo sapiens arrived on the continent more than 60,000 years ago, perhaps even earlier. They probably came from Southeast Asia, when the seas were lower during the Ice Age and island chains formed bridges between the continents. With simple boats, they crossed straits, which were dangerous even then, and found a vast, largely untouched world in Australia. The first humans lived in small groups that had to adapt to the most diverse landscapes. Australia offered incredible diversity: tropical rainforests in the north, vast savannas, rivers and lakes, mountain ranges, and the endless outback in the interior. Each region presented its own challenges, and each region was developed over thousands of years by people who adapted their techniques, tools, and rituals to the environment. This gave rise to a culture that was characterized not only by survival, but also by a deep spiritual relationship with nature. The Aborigines developed a close connection to their land, which for them was not just soil, but a living being that lived on in stories and songs. This spiritual dimension is known as the Dreamtime. The Dreamtime, or dreaming, is more than a religion in the Western sense. It is an all-encompassing worldview that connects the past, present, and future. According to the myths of the Aborigines, ancestral beings created the world in the Dreamtime. They formed rivers and mountains, created plants and animals, gave people rules for living together, and left their traces in the landscape. Every rock, every watercourse could carry a story, and these stories were passed down from generation to generation, often in songs, dances, and rock paintings. Rock carvings, such as those in Kakadu or Arnhem Land, bear witness to this long tradition to this day. Some are over 20,000 years old and are among the oldest still visible works of art of mankind. They show animals, hunting scenes, and spiritual symbols that still have significance today. The social life of the Aborigines was strongly influenced by this worldview. Tribal groups were connected to each other via songlines, imaginary routes through the country that were described in songs. These songs were not only spiritual texts, but also precise maps and traditions of water sources, hunting grounds, and paths through the desert. In this way, Aboriginal people combined their practical knowledge with their mythology, ensuring that the community could survive even in the harshest of areas. Over tens of thousands of years, hundreds of different language groups developed, each with its own traditions, ceremonies, and laws. Despite this diversity, they all had in common that land and spirituality were inextricably linked. A person did not simply belong to a region, he was a part of that country, and the country was part of his identity. For science, the colonization of Australia is also so fascinating because it shows how flexible and resilient humans can be. Long before cities and agriculture emerged in Mesopotamia or Egypt, the Aborigines had found ways not only to survive in Australia's harsh environment, but to build a rich culture that lasted for thousands of years. When we talk about the history of Australia today, it does not begin in 1788 with the arrival of the first fleet, but in the distant past, when the first humans left their footprints in the red sand and created an entire worldview with their songs and stories that lives on today. Chapter 3: Indigenous Peoples' Lifestyles, Languages, and Cultures. The culture of the Aborigines is one of the oldest, continuously existing of mankind. Over tens of thousands of years, diverse ways of life developed that were closely adapted to the respective environment and were passed on from generation to generation. Australia was by no means a unified space, but a mosaic of landscapes, climates, and resources, and the societies that lived in it were just as diverse. In the tropical north, people lived off the abundance of rainforests, coasts, and estuaries. Fish, crabs, turtles, and waterfowl formed the basis of the diet there. In the arid center, on the other hand, where water was scarce and conditions were harsh, the groups had to develop a sophisticated knowledge of waterholes, seasonal plants, and migratory herds of animals. Each region had its own techniques of survival, and each community carefully preserved this knowledge, often in the form of songs, stories, and rituals. The Aborigines were nomads or semi-nomads. They followed the seasons, moved to certain places during periods of rain or drought, and adapted their movements to nature. This mobile life did not mean that they had no attachment to places. On the contrary, every clan, every family had sacred sites that were part of their identity. They saw themselves not only as inhabitants of a country, but as its protectors. Linguistically and culturally, Australia was a world of its own. Before European colonization, there were several hundred different languages, often with numerous dialects. Some regions had close linguistic affinities. In other areas, the differences were so great that neighboring tribes needed interpreters. Language was not only a means of communication, but also carried spiritual significance, because the knowledge of the ancestors was passed on in songs and myths. Social life was determined by a complex network of rules. Family relationships regulated who was allowed to marry whom, who was responsible for certain rituals, and what tasks men and women had. These rules were strict, but they ensured that the community remained stable and resources were distributed fairly. Ceremonies played a special role. Initiation rituals marked the transition from child to adult. Dances and songs reminded us of the Dreamtime stories and strengthened people's connection to their country. Often, these rituals were associated with art, with body paintings, petroglyphs, and carved symbols. Art here was not mere decoration, but a means of making spiritual knowledge visible. The connection between art, nature, and spirituality was also evident in the music. The didgeridoo, a traditional wind instrument from the north, is just one of many examples. It accompanied rituals, produced sounds that were understood as ancestral voices, and combined music with spirituality. Equally important were the songlines, songs that described geographical routes and were map, history, and spiritual connection all in one. The Aborigines lived in a world that remained invisible to Europeans for a long time, a world full of meanings, in which every stone, every hill, every river carried a story. These stories made the country a living network that one could not own, but to which one belonged. Today, we know that these cultures were not static. They evolved, adapted to climate change, environmental changes, and new challenges. But at its core, a deep connection to nature and the Dreamtime remained. This connection made Aboriginal cultures unique and vulnerable at the same time, as a radical break arose with the arrival of Europeans. Chapter 4. The First Contacts with the Outside World, Makassan Fishermen and Early Visitors. Long before European ships reached the shores of Australia, there had already been contacts between the indigenous peoples of the continent and outsiders. While these encounters were sporadic and of limited impact, they show that Australia was not completely isolated. Relations with the Makassan fishermen from present-day Indonesia, who had regularly visited the northern coasts for centuries, were particularly important. The Makassan came from the island of Sulawesi and were skilled seafarers. From the 17th century, perhaps even earlier, they came to northern Australia in large praus, traditional sailing boats, especially to the coasts of Arnhem Land. Their goal was to harvest trepang, a type of sea cucumber that was prized in China as a delicacy in medicine. The fishermen spent months on the coasts, setting up camps, drying, and processing the sea cucumbers before returning to their homeland with full ships. For the Aborigines in the north, this encounter meant a new experience. They traded with the Makassan, exchanging products such as tortoiseshell, mother-of-pearl, or food for metal tools, fabrics, and tobacco. Iron knives and axes in particular were coveted goods that made everyday life easier. Some Aboriginal groups even worked seasonally with the fishermen and participated in the trepang harvest. These contacts left traces in language, art, and culture. Some indigenous groups adopted words from the Makassan language, and to this day there are rock paintings depicting ships with high sails, clear representations of the praus. The encounters were not always free of conflict, but on the whole they were an exchange based on mutual benefit. In addition to the Makassan, there were probably other early visitors. Some historians suggest that Portuguese navigators mapped parts of the coast as early as the 16th century, although there is no definitive evidence of this. What is certain, however, is that Dutch ships landed on the coasts of northern and western Australia several times in the 17th century. They referred to the country as New Holland, but they paid little attention to it because of its arid landscape and lack of obvious riches. For the Aborigines, these contacts were small irritations in an otherwise continuous life. They had inhabited and farmed their land for thousands of years, and the alien ships, while interesting, did little to change their world at first. It was not until the British, who came in the late 18th century and brought not only trade but permanent settlements, that the profound change began. But the traces of these early encounters are still visible today. In Arnhem Land, stories, songs, and pictures remind us of the Aborigines, or Makassan, foreign sailors who came from the north. They are memories of a time when Australia was far away, but was still part of the networks that had long connected the Indian Ocean and Southeast Asia. Chapter 5: European Explorers, from the Portuguese to James Cook. When the great European voyages of discovery began in the 15th and 16th centuries, the southern part of the world also increasingly came into focus. The dream of the Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land, fired the imagination of many seafarers. It was believed that somewhere beyond the equator there must be a huge continent that established the balance of the land masses. This idea led to numerous expeditions heading south. The Portuguese, who were the first to find the sea route to India and the Pacific, may have reached the shores of Australia as early as the early 16th century. Map fragments and reports suggest that they may have seen parts of the north. But there is no clear evidence, and if they did find the land, they left no lasting traces. What is certain, however, is that the Dutch were among the first Europeans to systematically map Australia in the 17th century. From their base on Java, numerous ships of the Dutch East India Company sailed south. In 1606, the navigator Willem Janssen landed with his ship Duifken on the coast of Cape York in what is now Queensland. This made him the first European to set foot on Australian soil. In the decades that followed, other Dutch captains mapped large parts of the west and north coasts. In 1616, Dirk Hartog left behind a famous pewter plate on the west coast, which is now considered one of the oldest European relics in Australia. Abel Tasman, another famous navigator, sailed around the island, which was later named Tasmania after him, in 1642 and discovered New Zealand. The Dutch called the new land New Holland, but since it was barren, dry, and seemingly without riches, they showed little interest in settling. Spaniards and French also ventured individual expeditions to the region, but they also saw Australia more as a geographical curiosity than as a destination. It was only with the British that the picture changed. In 1768, James Cook set out on behalf of the British Crown to make astronomical observations in the Pacific and, at the same time, to explore the Terra Australis. His voyage on the Endeavour became one of the most important expeditions in the history of discovery. Cook sailed along the east coast, which was previously unknown, and set foot ashore for the first time in Botany Bay on 29 April 1770. Cook was not the first European in Australia, but his arrival marked the beginning of a new chapter. Unlike the Dutch, the British looked at the coast with different eyes. They saw not only barren deserts, but fertile landscapes, rivers, and forests that were suitable for a colony. Cook officially took possession of the land for Great Britain and called it New South Wales. For the Aborigines who lived on the coast, the encounter with Cook was a brief, irritating moment. They watched the alien ships, did not understand their intentions, and had no idea that this event would mark the beginning of an invasion that would change their lives forever. Cook's expedition opened the door for British colonization, which was soon to follow. What was a discovery for the Europeans became the beginning of a catastrophe for the indigenous people. But at that moment, it was still a historic milestone. The end of Australia's long isolation and the beginning of its integration into the world history of the Western powers. Chapter 6: 1788, The First Fleet and the Founding of Sydney. On 26 January 1788, a fleet of 11 ships under the command of Captain Arthur Phillip reached the coast of New South Wales. This First Fleet, as it was later called, consisted of 2 naval ships, 6 prisoner transports, and 3 supply ships. On board were around 1,500 people: soldiers, sailors, officers, some free settlers, and, above all, prisoners, who were to serve their sentences in the new colony. With them, the European settlement of Australia began. The arrival was not an accidental event. Britain faced a problem in the late 18th century. Prisons were overcrowded, and after the independence of the United States, it was no longer possible to deport convicts there, as had been the case before. Australia appeared as a solution, far away, with space, and seemingly unused. James Cook's report on New South Wales had described the region as suitable, and so the British government decided to set up a penal colony there. The first fleet first landed in Botany Bay, where Cook had landed in 1770. But the soil proved to be unsuitable, and there was a lack of fresh water. Philip sailed further north and found a better place in Port Jackson, a sheltered bay with plenty of water and land. It was here that the first settlement was founded, Sydney Cove, which later became the heart of the city of Sydney. The beginning of the colony was marked by great difficulties. The settlers did not know the climatic conditions, the soils were unfamiliar, and the harvests were poor. Food shortages were a constant problem, and survival could only be ensured by supplying supply ships. Discipline problems, illnesses, and conflicts between soldiers and convicts made life even more difficult. In addition, there was contact with the Aborigines, who had lived in the region for thousands of years. For them, the arrival of the Europeans was a drastic shock. They saw foreigners occupy their land, claim resources, and disrupt traditional ways of life. In the beginning, there were cautious encounters, barter, and curious observations. But tensions, misunderstandings, and violence soon developed. Diseases introduced by Europeans wreaked havoc on indigenous communities because they had no immunity to them. For the convicts, Australia initially meant an extension of their sentence. But many of them were given the opportunity to cultivate land after serving their sentences. This is how the first small farms and settlements emerged, which slowly expanded the surrounding area of Sydney. Despite all the difficulties, the colony grew, and the initial camp developed into a permanent society. The founding of Sydney in 1788 was more than just the beginning of a city. It marked the starting point of a development that was to change Australia forever. For the British, it was a pragmatic step towards solving their problems. For the Aborigines, it was the beginning of a colonization that radically changed their lives and culture. Today, January 26, the day of the landing, commemorates this moment as Australia Day. For many Australians, it is a day of national unity and celebration. For many Aboriginal people, however, it is an invasion day, a day of mourning that commemorates the loss of land, life, and freedom. Both perspectives make it clear how deeply the founding of Sydney has shaped the history of the continent.
Chapter 7: Penal Colony and Early Colonial Society. The first decades of European settlement in Australia were dominated by the penal colony. Sydney and the surrounding settlements were not normal colonies of settlers who emigrated voluntarily, but a forced project of the British state. Between 1788 and 1868, more than 160,000 convicts were deported to Australia, men, women, and even children who had often been convicted of comparatively minor offenses in Britain. Life in the colony was hard and strict. The convicts were used on farms, in road construction, in workshops, or in the construction of public buildings. Some had to do heavy work in the Outback under guard. Others had easier tasks and could start a new life after their sentence expired. Those who behaved well could receive tickets of leave, a kind of partial release that allowed them to work independently. In this way, many former convicts were given the chance to put down roots as farmers or craftsmen. The military order shaped society. Officers from the Royal Marines and later the New South Wales Corps ruled life, distributing land, controlling trade, and keeping the convicts at bay. It was not uncommon for abuse of power to occur, and some officers used their position to become rich themselves. Particularly notorious was the so-called rum trade, in which officers monopolized the trade in alcohol and thus exerted great influence. But the colony was not just an outdoor prison. Structures of a functioning society emerged early on. Churches were built, schools were founded, markets were set up. The colony needed craftsmen, doctors, teachers, and so a free society slowly grew up alongside the penal society. Some convicts who had served their sentences rose to become wealthy citizens, founded families, and contributed to the construction of the colony. The colonial government also gradually promoted the settlement of free settlers in order to make the colony more economically independent. Land was given to soldiers, officers, and later also to immigrants. Agriculture, especially the cultivation of wheat and the keeping of livestock, became the basis of food and trade. For the Aborigines, however, this development was a catastrophe. As the colony grew, they lost more and more land. Pastures displaced traditional hunting grounds, diseases weakened communities, and conflicts repeatedly led to violence. The contact with the Europeans did not bring integration, but marginalization. Despite all the hardships, the colony slowly developed its own self-image in the early 19th century. The people, whether convicts, former prisoners, or free settlers, lived far away from London and developed a certain independence. The hard life in the new country shaped their character, and they began to see themselves not only as British, but also as Australians, an identity that was to develop for a long time to come, but had its origins here. So the penal colony was not just an experiment by the British government, but the foundation on which Australia was built. It brought suffering and oppression, but also opportunities and a new society that emerged from a mixture of coercion and freedom.
Chapter 8: Conflicts with the Aborigines, Frontier Wars, and Land Grabbing. With the expansion of the British colonies in Australia, conflicts with the indigenous peoples inevitably arose. For the Aboriginal people, the land was not just a resource, but a part of their identity and spirituality. For the Europeans, on the other hand, it was an economic basis that was to be cultivated, fenced in, and farmed. These two worldviews collided, and from this collision arose the so-called Frontier Wars, a long period of violence that spanned more than a century. The first conflicts began shortly after the founding of Sydney. Settlers invaded areas that had been used by Aborigines for thousands of years and claimed them for agriculture or livestock farming. Water points were privatized, hunting grounds were lost, and animals that were important for indigenous food were displaced or hunted. For the Aborigines, this was not only an economic loss, but an existential threat to their entire life system. Some groups reacted with resistance. They carried out raids on farms, destroyed crops, or attacked settlers. However, these acts of defense were not understood by the colonial authorities as legitimate resistance, but as criminal acts. The reaction was often brutal: retaliatory actions, massacres, and systematic persecution. Entire communities were decimated, and the Aboriginal population shrank dramatically in some regions. The Frontier Wars were not a unified war with clear fronts, but a series of local conflicts that spanned the entire country. In Tasmania, the so-called Black War occurred in the 1820s, in which the conflicts between settlers and Aborigines were particularly fierce. On the mainland, the fighting in the Hunter Valley, Queensland, and the West led to new waves of violence. In addition to direct violence, diseases also had a devastating effect. Smallpox, influenza, and measles, which were introduced by the Europeans, hit the indigenous communities without any immunity. Entire groups became extinct within a few years, long before they even had direct contact with settlers. But despite these massive losses, many Aborigines held on to the resistance. Leaders such as Penal in the late 18th century or Yagan in Western Australia in the 19th century became symbolic figures of battle. Their stories, often referred to as rebellion by the colonial authorities, are now part of the national memory and show that Aboriginal people did not passively succumb to colonialism, but actively fought for their land and culture. The Frontier Wars did not end abruptly, but gradually moved into a phase of oppression and marginalization. Until the late 19th century, the Aborigines lost more and more land, were forced into reservations, and systematically excluded from colonial society. Their numbers had shrunk to a fraction of the original population, and many believed that they would disappear altogether as a people. Today, the history of Frontier Wars in Australia is being reassessed. For a long time, it was hidden from official narratives, but now historians and many Australians acknowledge that it was a phase of wars, a silent but devastating conflict that left a lasting mark on the continent. For the Aborigines, it was the loss of their land, their freedom, and often their lives. For the colonies, it was the bloody path to expansion. The Frontier Wars left a heavy legacy that can still be felt today in the relationships between Aboriginal people and the rest of Australian society. They show that Australia's history can be told not only of discovery and pioneering spirit, but of violence, injustice, and resistance.
Chapter 9: Inland Expansion, Explorers, Settlers, and Outback. While the first decades of the colony were dominated by Sydney and its immediate surroundings, a new urge developed in the early 19th century, the urge to expand inland. The pressure grew because the settlements on the coast needed more space for agriculture and livestock breeding, and at the same time, curiosity drove the people. What lay beyond the Blue Mountains that towered like a wall west of Sydney? How big was this country really? The first major expeditions led over the Blue Mountains in the 1810s and 1820s. Gregory Blaxland, William Lawson, and William Wentworth managed to find a way across the mountains in 1813, and in doing so, they opened the door to the interior of the continent. Behind it lay wide plains, fertile areas, and seemingly endless land for sheep and cattle. For the colonists, it was a triumph. For the Aborigines who lived there, a new phase of displacement began. In the decades that followed, explorers repeatedly set out to map the interior. Names such as Charles Sturt, Thomas Mitchell, or later John McDouall Stuart are still known today. They moved through deserts, rivers, and savannas in search of water, usable land, and above all, routes that could connect the colonies. Some of these journeys ended in success, others in tragedy. Burke and Will's 1860-61 expedition, which was to cross the continent from south to north, became one of the most famous dramas in Australian history. The two leaders died, weakened by hunger and exhaustion, although they had almost reached their destination. For the settlers and farmers, expansion was a promise. Sheep breeding in particular developed into a motor of the colony. Vast areas were turned into grazing land, and soon Australian wool became a sought-after export commodity that boosted the colony's prosperity. Entire regions that had previously been inhabited only by Aborigines were transformed into farming and grazing areas. But the expansion was not only a success story. The Outback, as the vast arid regions were called, posed enormous challenges. Water was scarce, summer heat and droughts made life difficult, and settlement projects repeatedly failed. In addition, there were renewed conflicts in many regions with the Aborigines, whose land was taken over. Some resisted, others were displaced by violence, disease, or forced resettlement. The expansion into the interior of the country was thus a double phenomenon. On the one hand, it was an expression of the European pioneering spirit, the search for land, resources, and opportunities. On the other hand, it was a phase of destruction for the indigenous cultures, which lost their ancestral territories. The image of the explorers was glorified in the 19th century. They were considered heroes who fought against heat, hunger, and thirst in order to map the unknown. In reality, many of these areas had been inhabited for thousands of years by Aboriginal people who knew exactly how to find paths, water holes, and resources. For the Europeans, it was new territory, for the Aborigines, home. Nevertheless, these expeditions had a lasting impact on the idea of Australia. The Outback became a myth, an endless, dangerous, but at the same time fascinating expanse that shaped the character of the nation. To this day, the image of the Outback pioneer is considered a symbol of toughness, resilience, and a thirst for adventure, qualities that Australians like to associate with their national identity. The expansion into the interior turned a small coastal colony into an entire country. It created new opportunities, but also new wounds that reverberated for a long time in Australia's history.
Chapter 10: The Era of the Sheep, Wool and Economic Advancement. In the early 19th century, as settlements grew beyond Sydney and new inland areas were developed, a development began that would shape Australia's economy for decades: sheep farming and wool production. Soon the saying was that Australia had built its prosperity on the backs of sheep, and indeed, wool became the most important export commodity that integrated the continent into the global economy. The first sheep arrived in the country with the first fleet in 1788, but it was not until a few decades later that it developed into a flourishing industry. Farmer John MacArthur, in particular, played a central role in this. He brought merino sheep to Australia, whose wool was of particularly high quality, and founded large sheep farms in New South Wales. It quickly became clear that the dry climate and the vast plains of Australia were excellently suited for these animals. From then on, sheep farming spread rapidly. More and more settlers penetrated the interior to claim huge pastures.
Entire regions that had previously been sparsely populated turned into farming areas. Sheep stations, often several hundred square kilometers in size, became the backbone of rural society. The demand for wool in Great Britain was enormous. With industrialization and the rise of textile factories in cities such as Manchester or Leeds, the demand for raw materials increased. Australian wool became an export hit that was shipped across the world's oceans. As early as the middle of the 19th century, it contributed most of the colony's income. This boom profoundly changed society. Wealthy sheep farmers, the so-called squatters, became a new elite. They had vast areas of land, political power, and economic influence. Many of them had originally been settlers without official land rights, who simply took land on which to keep their herds. It was only later that their claims were legalized, consolidating their wealth. But the era of the sheep also had a dark side. The spread of the pastures meant a massive displacement of the Aborigines. Traditional hunting grounds were fenced off, water points were blocked, and livestock destroyed the natural environment. Again and again, there were bloody clashes, in which the indigenous population drew the short straw. Sheep farming brought prosperity to the settlers, but suffering and destruction to the original inhabitants of the land. Life was not easy for the farmers themselves either. The work on the large wards was hard, the climate unpredictable. Periods of drought or diseases such as the sheep louse could destroy entire herds and livelihoods. Nevertheless, sheep farming remained the basis of the Australian economy and shaped not only the country, but also the culture. The image of the shepherd wandering through the endless plains with his dogs became a symbol of the Australian attitude to life. In the course of the 19th century, the wool boom led to an ever closer exchange with Great Britain. Australia became part of the global trade network, and British investors saw the continent as a safe supplier. This also strengthened the bond with the empire, which was later to have political consequences. So, the era of the sheep was not only an economic chapter, but also a cultural one. It shaped landscapes, societies, and identities. To this day, Australia has the reputation of being a country of sheep, even though the economy has long since become more diverse. Chapter 11. The Gold Rush: Boom, Immigration, and Social Tensions. Hardly any other era has changed Australia as rapidly as the gold rush in the middle of the 19th century. What began as a chance find quickly developed into a mass movement that attracted hundreds of thousands of people from all over the world and changed the face of the continent forever. The first gold discoveries were made in the early 1850s in New South Wales and Victoria. The news spread quickly, and within a few months, fortune seekers flocked to the new goldfields. Entire cities grew out of thin air, tent camps turned into bustling settlements, and populations exploded. In just a decade, Australia's population doubled, a dramatic change for a young colony that had remained comparatively small until then. The gold rush brought a completely new diversity to the country. People from Europe, North America, South America, and Asia followed the call of gold. A particularly large number of Chinese came to Victoria, where they worked in the fields or became active as traders and craftsmen. However, this immigration also led to tensions. Racist prejudices, competition for resources, and cultural differences triggered conflicts that erupted into violent conflicts. Life on the goldfields was hard and uncertain. Only a few actually became rich, most found just enough to survive. Illnesses, accidents, and poor living conditions were the order of the day. In addition, the colonial governments tried to earn money from the gold rush with licenses and taxes. Miners had to pay fees regardless of whether they were successful or not. This led to growing resentment, which finally culminated in the Eureka Uprising in Ballarat in 1854. The Eureka Rebellion was a turning point in Australian history. Miners rose up against the colonial government, erected barricades, and swore resistance under the Eureka flag. Although the uprising was bloodily suppressed by the authorities, it had far-reaching political consequences. It led to reforms that strengthened the rights of miners and is now considered a symbol of the struggle for democracy and self-determination in Australia. In addition to conflicts, the gold rush also brought progress. The sudden wealth attracted investment. Infrastructure was expanded. Roads, railways, and ports were built. Cities like Melbourne grew explosively and developed into economic centers. In the middle of the 19th century, Melbourne was at times considered one of the richest cities in the world, characterized by magnificent buildings and cultural boom. Socially, the gold rush led to greater social mixing. Unlike the old colonial society, which was heavily influenced by convicts and officers, the gold rush brought free immigrants to the country, bringing with them their own ideas of freedom, justice, and prosperity. These new ideas helped Australia evolve from a pure penal colony to a diverse society. For the Aborigines, however, the gold rush meant another disaster. Their lands were occupied on a large scale, rivers and soils were destroyed by mining, and they themselves were pushed to the margins. The boom that brought wealth to the colony deepened poverty and exclusion for them. Despite these dark sides, the gold rush remains a key moment. He made Australia world famous, opened it up to immigration, laid the foundation for its cities, and promoted political change. Above all, however, he gave the young country a new self-confidence. Australia was no longer just a place for convicts, but a land of opportunity, a country where one could seek one's fortune.
Chapter 12. Colonies Become Societies, the Path to More Self-Government. With the expansion of settlements, the boom in sheep farming, and the gold rush, Australia changed from a distant penal colony to a dynamic society in the 19th century. The population grew rapidly, cities emerged, trade and infrastructure developed, and with this development, the desire for more political participation also grew. What had once begun under strict military rule now strove for self-government. It was clear early on that the colonies could not simply exist as outposts of Great Britain. The great distance from the motherland made direct control difficult, and the rapidly growing population demanded its own rules. The first beginnings of self-government appeared in the 1820s, when a legislative council was formed in New South Wales to support the colonial administration. At first, it was only an advisory body, but over time it gained more influence. The decisive change came in the middle of the 19th century. Driven by the gold rush and the associated social tensions, the pressure on governments to grant people more rights grew. The Eureka Uprising in 1854 was a clear signal. The colonists not only wanted to pay taxes, they also wanted to have a say. In the 1850s, most colonies finally received their own constitutions, which granted them extensive self-government. Parliaments were formed which were organized according to the British model, with a House of Commons and an upper house. Elections were introduced, and even though the right to vote was initially severely restricted, for example to wealthy men, this was a decisive step towards democracy. Over time, the right to vote was expanded, and Australia became a pioneer. It introduced women's suffrage at the national level as early as 1902, long before many other Western countries took this step. In addition to political self-government, a strong sense of regional identity also developed. Each colony, whether New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, South Australia, Western Australia, or Tasmania, developed its own culture, economy, and politics. There was rivalry between them, for example on trade issues or railway connections, which were often built with different gauges. At the same time, however, they were united by the common British heritage and the close ties to the Empire. This double movement, more independence on the one hand and loyalty to the crown on the other, shaped the 19th century. Australians saw themselves as free citizens who elected their own parliaments, but at the same time as proud subjects of the British king or queen. This tension would later play a central role in the Federation. Self-government also brought with it social reforms. Unions gained influence, workers demanded better conditions, and Australia was a world leader in some areas. The introduction of the 8-hour day in Melbourne in 1856 is considered a milestone in the workers' movement. The idea of a fairer society also took shape, an ideal that later played a central role in the idea of Australia as an egalitarian country. At the same time, the reality remained contradictory. While the white settlers were given more rights and developed democratic institutions, the Aborigines were systematically excluded. They were not considered equal citizens in colonial society, but were marginalized, forced into reservations, and often deprived of their children. The democracy that emerged in Australia was a limited one. It applied only to those who were part of colonial society. Despite these downsides, the path to self-administration was a decisive step. Penal colonies had become functioning societies that developed politically, economically, and culturally. Australia was not yet a nation, but the foundations for a later unification had been laid.
Chapter 13. The Federation of 1901, Birth of the Commonwealth of Australia. On January 1st, 1901, an event occurred that had a decisive impact on Australian history. The 6 British colonies on the continent joined together to form the Commonwealth of Australia. This created a new state that remained part of the British Empire but developed its own national identity. This move was the result of decades of discussion, debate, and negotiation that answered the question of how independent colonies could become a nation. In the 19th century, the individual colonies had made great strides towards self-government, but they had remained independent of each other. Each colony had its own parliament, its own administration, its own laws, and even its own railway tracks, which were often incompatible with each other. Although they shared a common British heritage, there was competition at the same time, especially between Sydney and Melbourne, the 2 largest cities. Nevertheless, the idea of a federation became more and more attractive. Common trade interests played a role. Tariff barriers between the colonies hindered the internal market, and a unified economic policy promised advantages. The defense was also an argument. Given the geographical size of the continent, it was clear that a joint army and navy would make more sense than 6 separate colonial militias. In addition, towards the end of the century, a sense of shared identity grew. Australians may have regional differences, but they began to see themselves as part of a larger community, shaped by pride in their achievements and the awareness of living in a unique country. Debates about federation intensified in the 1890s. Representatives of the colonies met in conventions to work out a common constitution. This constitution was strongly based on the British system, but also contained elements from the USA, such as the federal structure with a national parliament composed of 2 chambers, the House of Representatives and the Senate. Each colony was to retain its independence, but at the same time be part of a national government. The question of where the capital should be located was particularly controversial. Sydney and Melbourne vied for this status, but in the end, a compromise was settled. A new capital was to be built between the 2 cities. This is how Canberra came into being, which later became the political center of Australia. On January 1st, 1901, the Federation officially came into force. In solemn ceremonies, the Commonwealth of Australia was proclaimed, and Edmund Barton became the first Prime Minister. The country was now a nation, united under a constitution that still forms the basis of the political system today. Importantly, Australia remained part of the British Empire despite the Federation. The British monarch was head of state, represented by the Governor-General, and Britain retained influence on foreign policy and constitutional amendments. So, Australia was a self-governing country, but not a completely independent nation. It was not until the course of the 20th century that full independence was to be achieved step by step. For the Aborigines, the Federation did not bring any improvements. On the contrary, in the new constitution, they were not even counted. They were not considered part of the national community, but remained excluded and disenfranchised. The young nation defined itself primarily by the White Australia policy, a policy that severely restricted immigration from non-European countries and understood Australia as a white, British-influenced state. Despite this dark side, the Federation was a crucial milestone. It gave Australia a national structure, a common voice, and the opportunity to develop as a nation in its own right. From then on, Australia was no longer just a collection of colonies, but a country, young, ambitious, and in search of its role in the world. Chapter 14. Australia in the First World War, Gallipoli and National Identity. When World War I broke out in 1914, Australia was only 13 years old, a young country still in the process of shaping its national identity. Politically and culturally, it remained closely linked to Britain, so it was hardly surprising that Australia immediately followed London's entry into the war. For many Australians, the war was an opportunity to prove their loyalty to the empire and at the same time to make their own nation visible on the world stage.
Around 416,000 Australians volunteered for military service, an enormous number for a population of less than 5 million. Many were young, full of adventure, and convinced that they would experience a short, glorious war in Europe. But the reality on the fronts proved to be bloody, protracted, and traumatic. Particularly famous and formative for national memory was the deployment of the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, ANZAC, in the Gallipoli campaign in 1915. Under British command, Australian and New Zealand troops landed on the Gallipoli Peninsula in present-day Turkey with the aim of securing the Dardanelles and thus opening access to Constantinople. But the landing on April 25, 1915 turned into a disaster. The soldiers encountered fierce resistance from the Ottoman army, which knew the terrain and had heavily fortified it. For months, the ANZAC troops held their positions in difficult conditions. Heat, disease, lack of water, and constant attacks claimed countless victims. In the end, the Allies had to call off the operation, and the campaign ended without military success. For Australia, however, Gallipoli had a deeper meaning. The courage, comradeship, and sacrifice of the soldiers became a symbol of a new, separate identity, independent of Great Britain, but nevertheless united in loyalty. April 25, the day of the landings, was later declared ANZAC Day and remains one of Australia's most important national holidays to this day. On this day, people commemorate not only Gallipoli, but all soldiers who fought for Australia. The ANZAC legend, coined by terms such as mateship, bravery, and perseverance, became a central element of Australia's self-awareness. In addition to Gallipoli, Australian troops also fought on the Western Front in France and Belgium. There, they experienced the horrors of trench warfare, trenches, artillery shelling, gas attacks, and endless losses. In battles such as Fromelles, Pozières, or Villers-Bretonneux, tens of thousands of Australians lost their lives. In total, more than 60,000 Australians died in the First World War, and another 150,000 were wounded. For a small nation, this was an enormous death toll that left its mark on almost every family. The home front was also marked by war. Women took on new roles in factories and agriculture to maintain supplies. Politically, there were bitter debates about the introduction of compulsory military service. In two referenda in 1916 and 1917, the population spoke out against it, a sign that the enthusiasm for the war was not unbroken. After the war, many soldiers returned traumatized. They suffered from injuries, from shell shock, what we now know as post-traumatic stress disorder, and from the difficulties of reintegrating into civilian life. Nevertheless, the national consciousness had grown. Australia had not only fought on the side of the Empire, but had fought for its own place in world history. Gallipoli and the Western Front had a profound influence on Australia's culture of remembrance. They gave the young country a history of joint sacrifice and a legend that went far beyond military successes. The First World War did not make Australia a great power, but it did give it a voice that became increasingly self-confident and would emancipate itself more strongly from Britain in the decades to come.
Chapter 15. Interwar Period. Politics, Economic Crises, and Social Movements. The years after the First World War were a time of upheaval for Australia, marked by hope, but also by disappointments and deep crises. The country had made great sacrifices, more than 60,000 killed and countless wounded. Entire generations of young men were missing, and society had to learn to live with this gap. At the same time, a mood of pride arose. Australia had proven itself, it had shown its bravery, and had become visible as a nation. But this national self-discovery happened against the backdrop of a world that was politically unstable and economically uncertain. Politically, Australia remained closely linked to Great Britain, but it began to develop its own positions. Within the framework of the League of Nations and international agreements, the country gained more independence, even though it remained part of the empire. Foreign policy was cautious, often restrained, and Australia was strongly oriented towards London. Nevertheless, the idea of an independent role could no longer be completely overlooked. Internally, questions of social justice and economic development were in the foreground. The return of the soldiers led to programs that were supposed to provide them with land and work. Many were given small farms, the so-called soldier settlement movement, but not all of them were successful. Often, the soils were poor or the land too small to be farmed profitably. Many veterans failed and faced poverty again. Nevertheless, the 1920s initially brought a certain spirit of optimism. New technologies such as the car, the radio, and the cinema found their way into the market and changed everyday life. Cities such as Sydney and Melbourne continued to grow, and in cultural fields, Australia began to cautiously develop its own forms of expression. At the same time, the traditional ties to Great Britain remained strong. The White Australia policy remained in place, and the society saw itself above all as white, British, and European-oriented. But the apparent stability collapsed dramatically with the world economic crisis of 1929. Australia was heavily dependent on exports, especially wool and wheat. When prices on the world market collapsed, the Australian economy also crashed. Millions of people lost their jobs, poverty and hunger spread. The crisis was so severe that it provoked deep political tensions. The government tried to counteract this with austerity measures, but this only led to more dissatisfaction. Protests, demonstrations, and strikes became more frequent. During this time, trade unions and workers' movements gained great influence. They demanded social reforms, better working conditions, and state support. New political forces such as the Communists also made a stronger appearance, although they never achieved a majority. The interwar period was also a time in which cultural identity was discussed more intensively. Writers, artists, and intellectuals asked what it meant to be Australian. The bond with Great Britain was still strong, but at the same time, there was a feeling that Australia had to develop its own face, shaped by the vastness of the country, the Outback, the mateship, and the egalitarian spirit that was palpable in everyday life. Despite economic and social difficulties, Australia remained a democracy. Elections, parliaments, and trade unions shaped political life. In this respect, the country differed from many other states that slipped into dictatorships or authoritarian systems in the 1930s. Australia preserved its institutions and showed remarkable stability, even when society was deeply divided. As the 1930s drew to a close, Australia was still scarred by the aftermath of the crisis, but at the same time, it was about to find itself drawn once again into a global conflict. With the rise of Nazi Germany, the war in Europe, and the threat of Japan in the Pacific, the country was on the edge of a new ordeal that would once again test its fledgling nation.
Chapter 16. Australia in World War II. Threat from Japan and the U.S. as a new partner. When Great Britain declared war on Germany in September 1939, Australia automatically followed. The close ties to the empire made an independent course hardly conceivable at the time. Many Australians still felt part of the British family, and so hundreds of thousands volunteered again to fight alongside London. At first, the war was a distant conflict for Australia. Troops fought in North Africa, the Middle East, and later in Europe. But with Japan's entry into the war at the end of 1941, the situation changed dramatically. Suddenly, Australia itself was threatened. The attack on Pearl Harbor, the rapid conquest of large parts of Southeast Asia, and especially the fall of Singapore in February 1942 shocked the nation. Singapore had been considered an impregnable fortress of the British, but when it fell, the Japanese armed forces were only a few thousand kilometers away from Australia. The threat soon became real. On February 19, 1942, the Japanese Air Force bombed Darwin in northern Australia. It was the most serious attack on Australian soil in history, in which hundreds of people died. In the following months, there were further bombings in northern Australia, as well as attacks by submarines off the east coast, even in Sydney Harbour. For the first time, the population experienced that the war not only took place far away, but could reach their own homeland directly. In this situation, Australia fundamentally changed its foreign policy orientation. Prime Minister John Curtin declared that Australia could no longer rely solely on Britain. Instead, he turned to the United States. General Douglas MacArthur, who was transferred to Australia after the retreat from the Philippines, made the country an important base for the war in the Pacific. From here, operations against Japan were planned, and American troops poured into the country.
For Australians, this was a profound change. Britain was far away and weakened, while the US was now present as a protecting power. This shift marked the beginning of a new partnership that would shape Australia's foreign policy for decades to come. Militarily, Australian soldiers made important contributions to the Pacific War. They fought in New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, and Borneo, often under extreme conditions in the jungle. In particular, the Battle of Kokoda Track in 1942 became a symbol of Australian determination. There, poorly equipped but stubborn Australian troops opposed the advancing Japanese and prevented them from taking Port Moresby, a success that was crucial for Australia's defense. The home front was also severely affected. Hundreds of thousands of men were at war, and women took on new roles in factories, agriculture, and even in uniforms and auxiliary services. Food was rationed, the population prepared for possible invasions, and cities were darkened to protect them from airstrikes. The war welded society together, but also changed role models and laid the foundation for later social developments. By the time the war ended in 1945, Australia had made great sacrifices, more than 30,000 dead, tens of thousands wounded, and a society that had experienced the horrors of war firsthand. But at the same time, the country was strengthened. It had shown that it was capable of defending itself and had found a new position in the world through its partnership with the United States. The Second World War was thus a double turning point for Australia. It meant the end of exclusive dependence on Great Britain and the beginning of a close security relationship with the United States. At the same time, it strengthened national self-confidence. Australia was no longer just an appendage of the empire, but an independent actor in world politics.
Chapter 17. Post-war period. Waves of immigration and populate or perish. After the end of the Second World War, Australia was at a crossroads. The country had proven militarily resilient, but the threat from Japan had highlighted how vulnerable it was. With a population of only about 7 million, Australia was huge in the country but small in population. Politicians and strategists were convinced that the security and future of the country could only be secured if more people came. This is how the motto, "Populate or perish," was born. Under this motto, one of the largest immigration campaigns in Australian history began. In the decades that followed, millions of people poured into the country. Initially, the government focused on immigrants from Britain and other parts of Europe. Ships full of migrants reached Australian ports, often financed by programs that made the crossing cheaper. Many of these people were traumatized by the war and sought a new life in Australia, far away from the destruction of Europe. However, it soon became clear that British migration alone would not be enough to reach the desired population size. Australia also opened its doors to people from Southern Europe, Italians, Greeks, Maltese, and later Yugoslavs and Turks. These groups changed the face of the nation permanently. They brought with them new cultures, languages, cuisines, and traditions, and gradually made Australia a multicultural society. However, immigration has not always been smooth. Many newcomers encountered prejudice and discrimination. The White Australia policy, which officially existed since 1901 and severely restricted non-European immigration, remained in place until the 1970s. Asian migrants were turned away, and for a long time, society saw itself primarily as white and European. It was not until decades later that this image was to change. Parallel to immigration, the economy changed. In the 1950s and 1960s, Australia experienced a real boom. Industrialization, mining, and infrastructure projects created prosperity. Cities like Sydney and Melbourne grew rapidly, new suburbs emerged, and with them an emerging middle class. Cars, televisions, and modern consumer goods found their way into the market and changed everyday life. The post-war period was also marked by political stability. Longtime prime ministers such as Robert Menzies led conservative governments that focused on growth, family values, and close ties to the Western world. At the same time, Australia developed a new security policy self-image. In 1951, the ANZAC alliance was concluded with the USA, which linked Australia, New Zealand, and America in a defense partnership. This finally sealed the turn to the United States. For the Aborigines, the post-war period initially brought hardly any improvements.
They remained legally and socially marginalized, in many places isolated in reservations or mission stations. It was not until the 1960s a civil rights movement was to emerge that put its situation in the focus of national politics. However, the waves of immigration and the economic boom of the post-war period made Australia an entirely new country. A small, strongly British society became a diverse nation that slowly, albeit contradictorily, found its own place in the world. The message, populate or perish, had its effect. Australia was bigger, stronger, and more self-confident than ever before. Chapter 18: The Economic Miracle: Industrialization, Mining, and Prosperity. The post-war period ushered in not only a period of great immigration for Australia, but also an economic boom that profoundly changed the country. The 1950s and 1960s are often referred to as the Australian economic miracle, a time when industrialization, mining, and infrastructure projects laid the foundation for modern prosperity. For a long time, Australia had been strongly influenced by agriculture. Sheep, wool, and wheat had determined exports. But now a new era began. With the help of investments and modern technology, an industry developed that ranged from automotive construction to steel mills to the production of consumer goods. Factories sprang up in the suburbs of the big cities, creating new jobs and forming the basis for an emerging middle class. At the same time, mining experienced an upswing. Coal, iron, copper, and later also uranium were mined on a large scale. In the 1960s, large deposits of bauxite, the raw material for aluminum, were discovered, as well as huge iron ore reserves in Western Australia. These resources made Australia a sought-after trading partner, especially for the growing industrialized nations in Asia. Japan soon became one of the most important customers, and with it began a new economic partnership that would shape Australia's relationship with the region for decades. Economic growth was reflected in everyday life. Many Australians were able to afford their own house for the first time, often in the new suburbs, which were connected to cars and modern household appliances. The television arrived and changed social life as well as cinema and later rock and roll. A new self-confidence emerged. Australia was no longer just a supplier of raw materials to the empire, but a modern, prosperous state with its own industry and growing international importance. The government actively supported this change. Large-scale infrastructure projects such as the Snowy Mountain Scheme, a massive hydroelectric and irrigation project, supplied the country with energy and created jobs. Many immigrants also worked in such projects, which integrated them not only economically but also socially. But prosperity was not evenly distributed. While many Australians benefited from the upswing, the Aborigines remained largely excluded. In rural regions, they lived in poverty, often without access to education, healthcare, or regular jobs. Economic progress thus also increased social inequalities. Nevertheless, the economic miracle is considered a formative time. It laid the foundation for the modern Australian lifestyle: the home in the suburbs, the car in the driveway, the family holiday on the coast. These ideals became part of the national culture and shape the image of Australia to this day. At the same time, Australia's role in the global economy grew. The country was no longer just an appendage of Great Britain, but began to orient itself more towards Asia. The partnerships with Japan and other countries were harbingers of a development that would later make Australia a central player in the Asia-Pacific region. The Australian economic miracle was thus much more than just an economic boom. It was the moment when Australia moved from the edge of the global economy to the center of the Pacific region, a country that used its resources, industry, and people to build prosperity and a new identity. Chapter 19: Indigenous Civil Rights, from the 1967 referendum to the Mabo decision. While many Australians enjoyed the growing prosperity in the 1950s and 1960s, the Aborigines still lived on the margins of society. They were excluded from many rights, often isolated in reservations, and their cultures were oppressed by state policies and social exclusion. For a long time, the government's attitude was shaped by the assumption that the indigenous population must be assimilated, that they should abandon their own traditions and fit into the white majority society. But this policy led above all to discrimination and alienation. In the 1960s, this slowly began to change. Civil rights movements were on the rise worldwide. In the USA, African Americans fought for equal rights.
In South Africa, resistance to apartheid grew. These developments also inspired many Aboriginal people and their supporters in Australia. Students, activists, and Indigenous leaders demanded more rights, recognition, and an end to systematic discrimination. A decisive moment was the referendum of 1967. Until then, the Constitution did not count Aboriginal people as part of the population, and the federal government had no authority to legislate specifically for them, a responsibility that rested with the states and often led to unequal treatment. In the referendum, more than 90% of Australians voted to change the Constitution. This did not automatically give Aborigines full equality, but they were finally officially recognized, and the basis for further reforms was created. The result was a milestone that showed that the attitude of Australian society was slowly changing. In the decades that followed, the Indigenous civil rights movement continued to grow. Aborigines founded their own organizations, campaigned for better education and healthcare, and demanded the return of land. The question of the country in particular became the central issue. Since colonization, the doctrine of terra nullius had been in place, the idea that Australia was nobody's country when the British came. This concept ignored the millennia-old settlement by the Aborigines and served as a justification for the expropriation. Activists increasingly questioned this doctrine and demanded legal recognition of their land rights. The decisive breakthrough came in 1992 with the so-called Mabo decision. In a long legal battle, Eddie Mabo, a man from the Torres Strait Islands, had fought for the recognition of the traditional land rights of his people. The High Court of Australia finally agreed with him and declared the doctrine of terra nullius invalid. For the first time, Australia's highest court recognized that the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders had been legally and culturally connected to their land before the arrival of the Europeans. The Mabo decision was a historic turning point. It led to the Native Title Act of 1993, which allowed Indigenous groups to assert land rights provided they could prove their continued connection to an area. Although the path was often complicated and marked by legal hurdles, the decision had enormous symbolic power. She made it clear that Australia's history did not begin in 1788, and that the rights of the First Peoples could no longer be ignored. From the 1960s to the Mabo decision, there was a development that permanently changed Australia's self-image. The country began to come to terms with its colonial past, and to hear the voices of those who had long been silenced. It was not an easy process, and it has not been completed to this day. But the referendum of 1967 and the Mabo decision mark two cornerstones on the way to a fairer society.
Chapter 20: Australia and the World, Vietnam War, UN, and Regional Role. After the Second World War, Australia's foreign policy orientation had changed decisively. The close ties to Great Britain remained cultural, but in terms of security policy, it was replaced by the alliance with the United States. This shift was particularly evident during the decades of the Cold War, when Australia began to take a more active role on the international stage, whether in military conflicts, in the United Nations, or in the Asia-Pacific region. A formative chapter was Australia's participation in the Vietnam War. In the 1960s, the government followed the doctrine that communist expansion in Asia had to be prevented at all costs. True to the motto, forward defense, the aim was to combat conflicts not only on their own coasts, but at an early stage in neighboring regions. As the U.S. expanded its military presence in Vietnam, Australia followed its ally. In 1962, Canberra first sent advisors, later also combat troops. For many Australians, the war was a duty to the United States, and at the same time a protection against the fear that communism could advance further south from North Vietnam and ultimately to Australia. But over the years, the resistance grew. Images of napalm attacks, rising casualties, and conscription, which forced young men to serve in Southeast Asia, led to massive protests. In cities like Sydney and Melbourne, tens of thousands marched against the war, also inspired by the anti-war movements in the USA and Europe. The Vietnam War became a touchstone of Australia's society. On the one hand, it consolidated the military alliance with the United States. On the other hand, it divided the population and gave rise to new political movements. When the last troops withdrew in 1972, it was clear that the war had left more questions than answers about Australia's role in the world, about its dependence on the United States, and about its willingness to fight in foreign conflicts. At the same time, Australia played an active role in the United Nations. The country had already participated in the founding of the UN in 1945, and in the decades that followed, it was involved in peacekeeping missions and international organizations. Australian diplomats campaigned for disarmament, human rights, and the independence of small states in the Pacific. Especially in the post-war years, Australia was considered a reliable partner of the West, bringing its voice to the international stage. Australia's role also grew in the Asia-Pacific region. The economic rise of Japan and later the Tiger states in Southeast Asia changed the geopolitical environment. Australia, which had long looked primarily to Europe, had to deal more closely with its Asian neighbors. Trade relations, development programs, and diplomatic initiatives gained in importance. At the same time, the question of one's own identity remained present. Was Australia a Western country on the edge of Asia, or part of an Asia-Pacific community? This tension accompanied foreign policy for decades. On the one hand, the traditional alliances with the USA and Great Britain were maintained. On the other hand, they cautiously opened up to their neighbors, a balancing act that still exists today. Australia thus developed into an active international player in the second half of the 20th century. Whether in Vietnam, at the United Nations, or in relations with Asia, the country showed that it was ready to take responsibility. But each step also brought with it new questions about dependence on great powers, about one's own regional role, and about the balance between tradition and modernity.
Chapter 21. From the 1980s to the 21st century, Multiculturalism and Modern Society. The 1980s marked a profound social change for Australia. After decades in which national identity had been strongly tied to Britain and the concept of a white Australia, the country began to redefine itself. Immigration policies were liberalized, society became more diverse, and the ideal of multiculturalism gained in importance. At the same time, the economy, politics, and culture changed. Australia entered a modern era. A decisive step was the final departure from the White Australia policy. As early as the 1970s, governments had begun to relax racial restrictions. Under Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser, the concept of multiculturalism was actively promoted. The idea that immigrants did not have to give up their cultural identity, but that diversity was seen as an asset. People from Vietnam, Lebanon, Greece, Italy, China, and many other regions found a new home in Australia, and their languages, cuisines, and traditions increasingly shaped everyday life. However, with the growing cultural diversity, the question of national identity also arose. Was Australia still a British country on the edge of Asia, or was it now part of a globalized multicultural community? This debate came to a head in the 1990s, when Prime Minister Paul Keating argued for a stronger focus on Asia. At the same time, the discussion about a possible departure from the monarchy gained momentum. In 1999, a referendum on the establishment of a republic took place, but it narrowly failed, a sign that tradition and change were closely intertwined. The Aborigines were also more in focus. The Mabo decision of 1992 and the introduction of the Native Title Act in 1993 had opened the door for the recognition of traditional land rights. In the 1990s, the movement of the stolen generations came to light. Those children of Indigenous families who had been taken from their parents by state authorities for decades and placed in homes or foster families. The exposure of this systematic injustice led to a national debate about apologies and reparations. In 2008, Prime Minister Kevin Rudd finally issued an official apology in Parliament, a symbolic but significant step. Economically, Australia opened up more to globalization in the 1980s and 1990s. Reforms such as the liberalization of the financial sector, the introduction of free trade, and closer ties to Asian markets made the country more competitive.
Mining boomed again, especially due to increasing demand from China, which became one of Australia's most important trading partners in the 2000s. Culturally, Australia gained more self-confidence. Artists, musicians, writers, and filmmakers shaped an image that radiated far beyond the continent. Films like Crocodile Dundee or Mad Max brought Australian stories to the big screen. Bands like In Excess and Midnight Oil conquered the world stages, and writers like Peter Carey won international awards. The nation was no longer just a recipient of cultural influences, but an exporter itself. After all, as Australia entered the 21st century, it faced new challenges. The 2002 Bali terrorist attack, which killed many Australians, highlighted how closely the country's security was linked to the region. The missions in Afghanistan and Iraq showed the close alliance with the US, but they also provoked domestic political controversy. Multiculturalism, economic success, and global interdependence made Australia a modern society, but the question of identity, equality, and future remained central. Between tradition and progress, between Europe and Asia, between prosperity and social conflicts, the nation sought its way, a path that is still characterized by diversity and change today.
Chapter 22: Australia Today: Politics, Identity, and the Debate on the Republic and the Constitution. Australia in the 21st century is a modern, prosperous country that is firmly anchored in global structures and, at the same time, wrestles with questions of its own identity. Politically, it is a stable democracy with a parliamentary system based on the Westminster model. But beneath the surface are debates that reach deep into the national self-perception. Should Australia become a republic? How do you deal with the colonial past? And what role should the country play internationally? For decades, the political landscape has been dominated by two major parties, the Liberal Party and the Australian Labor Party. Both regularly alternate in government, with smaller parties such as the Greens or independent MPs also gaining influence, especially in the Senate. Despite this party political dynamic, Australia is considered one of the most stable democracies in the world, with free elections, a strong civil society, and a lively public debate. However, the form of government remains a central question. The British monarch, currently represented by the Governor-General, is still the formal head of state. Many Australians perceive this as an anachronism in a country that has long since become an independent nation. The 1999 referendum on the introduction of a republic failed, but the debate flares up again and again, especially with changes of throne in Great Britain. The question is not so much one of everyday life as one of symbolism. Should Australia finally take the step that formally completes its national independence? At the same time, the examination of one's own history has become more intensive. The Indigenous population has been demanding recognition, justice, and a say for decades. Movements such as the Voice to Parliament campaign, an advisory body for Aboriginal people at the national level, have shaped the political agenda. The question of a possible treaty, a treaty between the state and the First Peoples, is also repeatedly raised. These discussions show that Australia is not repressing its past, but is increasingly trying to integrate it into a just future. The Constitution, which came into force in 1901, still forms the basis of the political system, but many are calling for reforms to do justice to the realities of a modern society. Topics such as climate policy, migration, gender equality, and dealing with global crises raise questions about how flexible and sustainable the existing structures are. The question of identity also arises culturally. Australia today sees itself as a multicultural society, characterized by immigration from all parts of the world. Cities like Sydney and Melbourne are home to a mix of cultures that shape cuisine, language, and lifestyle. At the same time, the connection to the Outback, nature, and traditional symbols such as the ANZAC myth or the love of sports remains strong. This juxtaposition of tradition and modernity, of diversity and unity, makes national identity a dynamic process. At the international level, Australia is increasingly positioning itself as a middle power in the Asia-Pacific region. The close alliance with the USA remains, but at the same time, the economic ties with China are of enormous importance, a balance that is not always easy to maintain. Australia is a member of important international organizations, participates in peace missions, and is involved in regional security policy, especially within the framework of alliances such as AUKUS or in dialogue with ASEAN countries.
Australia today is therefore a country that is successful in many areas, rich in resources, diverse in its society, stable in its politics. But it is also a country that is constantly searching for its final form, between republic and monarchy, between colonial heritage and a just future for the Aborigines, between Western tradition and Asian neighborliness. These tensions are not a sign of weakness, but an expression of a nation that continues to evolve and keep moving.
Chapter 23. Australia in the 21st Century. Climate Change, Bushfires, and Global Responsibility. In the 21st century, Australia is a prosperous, modern country, but it faces challenges that test its society, its environment, and its international role. Climate change, in particular, has become a central issue, an issue that is as visible and existential for hardly any other country as it is for Australia. Australia is a continent of extreme nature. Droughts, bushfires, and floods have always been part of everyday life, but these phenomena have intensified in recent decades. The summer of 2019-2020, often referred to as the Black Summer, became a symbol of the urgency of the climate issue. Devastating bushfires raged for months, destroying millions of hectares of land, killing billions of animals, and claiming numerous lives. Entire communities were wiped out, and the smoke settled over cities like Sydney and Canberra so that air quality was at times worse than in the world's most polluted metropolises. These disasters made it clear how vulnerable Australia is to the consequences of climate change. Droughts threaten agriculture, rising temperatures increase the risk of fires, and coastal regions are at risk from sea level rise. At the same time, Australia is one of the largest exporters of coal and other fossil fuels, a paradoxical situation that causes political and social tensions. Climate policy has become one of the most controversial issues in Australian domestic politics. While many citizens and scientists are calling for a rapid transition to renewable energy, economic interests, especially mining, continue to have a major impact. Again and again, there are heated debates between environmental movements, industry representatives, and politicians. Protests, movements such as School Strike for Climate, and initiatives by Indigenous groups show that the topic has long since arrived at the center of public life. In addition to the ecological challenges, Australia is also facing new geopolitical challenges. As part of the Asia-Pacific region, it has to balance its relations between the US and China, a difficult balancing act, as both countries are central partners. The US as the most important military ally, China as the largest trading partner. Conflicts in the South China Sea, tensions over Taiwan, or trade disputes have put Australia in a complex situation in which it must protect its interests and, at the same time, consolidate its alliances. Responsibility towards neighboring countries in the Pacific is also growing. Many small island nations are existentially threatened by climate change, as rising sea levels threaten their livelihoods. Australia has a special role to play here, as a regional leader to provide support, but also as a country that can be a role model or an obstacle through its climate policy. At the same time, social debates are shaping the 21st century. Issues of equality, cultural diversity, and Aboriginal rights continue to be in focus. The discussion about the voice to Parliament, a constitutional body that is supposed to give Indigenous peoples a say, is an example of the attempt to integrate historical injustices into a modern democracy. Migration also remains a central issue. Australia is now one of the most diverse countries in the world, but the treatment of asylum seekers and refugees continue to cause controversy. Despite all the challenges, Australia remains a country with enormous opportunities. Its natural resources, geographical location, and stable democracy make it a major player in the 21st century. But the questions it has to answer today, how it deals with climate change, how it engages its Indigenous population, and how it positions itself between the great powers, will determine what the image of Australia will look like in the future. The 21st century has not only brought Australia prosperity and globalization, but also a responsibility for its own environment, for its neighbors in the Pacific, and for its role in a world that is changing rapidly. Chapter 24. Conclusion. Australia's history as a mirror of conflict, diversity, and change. The history of Australia is a story of contrasts, of ancient continuity and sudden upheavals, of beauty and hardship,
of opportunity, and deep injustice. It does not begin with the arrival of the Europeans in 1788, but with the first humans who came to the continent over 60,000 years ago. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures are among the oldest continuous traditions of mankind, sustained by the Dreamtime, the songlines, and a deep connection to the land. These cultures survived thousands of years of climate change and environmental change, but they were brutally shaken by European colonization. The arrival of the First Fleet marked the beginning of a new chapter that was a pragmatic solution for the British, but the beginning of displacement and frontier wars for the Aborigines. Convict society and military rule slowly grew into a colony, which gained economic importance through expansion inland, sheep breeding, and finally the gold rush. But all these developments happened at the expense of the original population, whose rights were ignored. The 19th century brought self-government and finally the Federation of 1901, and Australia became a nation united in the Commonwealth, but still closely tied to Great Britain. The First World War, especially Gallipoli, shaped the national identity and created the ANZAC myth that continues to have an impact today. The interwar period and the Great Depression presented the country with severe tests, but democracy survived them. The Second World War marked a turning point. Australia was directly threatened for the first time and turned away from its exclusive ties to Great Britain and towards an alliance with the United States. After the war, a phase of reconstruction began. Populate or perish brought millions of immigrants, the economic miracle created prosperity, and society became increasingly diverse. But the shadows of the past remained. The Aborigines remained disenfranchised until well into the 20th century, when the referendum of 1967 and later the Mabo decision finally brought steps towards recognition. These developments showed that Australia's path to justice is still not complete, but remains a living process. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, Australia stepped onto the world stage with more confidence. Multiculturalism became a lived reality, even if tensions remained. The debates about the Republic, the Constitution, and Indigenous participation shape the country just as its role in the Asia-Pacific region. At the same time, climate change is forcing Australia to deal with its responsibility towards nature and its neighbors. Australia today is a country of diversity, contrasts, and opportunities. His story reflects conflict and injustice, but also resilience, adaptability, and the ability to change. It shows how a penal colony became a modern nation, and how, in the midst of ruptures and contradictions, an identity has emerged that is unique. The legacy of the past remains palpable. In the songs of the Dreamtime, in the stories of Gallipoli, in the scars of the bushfires, in the voices of immigrants, and in the demands for justice for the First Peoples. Australia's history does not end. It is written daily, in the cities and in the Outback, in politics and in the arts, in the debates about the future. Australia is a mirror of conflict, diversity, and change, and that's exactly where its strength lies.